I spent most of Tuesday afternoon in a kitchen that smelled like rosemary and expensive red wine. Mark's favorite meal is a complicated red wine braised short rib that takes 6 hours of slow simmering to reach the point where the meat just falls away from the bone at the mere suggestion of a fork. I didn't mind the work. I actually enjoyed the ritual of it because I believed we were celebrating something we had built together. His promotion to senior vice president wasn't just a title change for him. It was the finish line of a 10-year marathon that I had run right beside him, often carrying his gear. I had set the table with the linen napkins we got for our wedding and polished the silver until my reflection looked back at me with a tired, proud smile. I even bought a bottle of vintage scotch he had mentioned once 3 years ago. I wanted everything to be perfect because I thought I was the guest of honor in his heart, even if the world only saw his name on the new office door. By 7 o'clock, the candles were halfway melted and the short ribs were beginning to dry out in the oven. Mark hadn't answered my last 3 texts. I figured he was just caught up in HR paperwork, or getting a head start on his new responsibilities. That was the lie I told myself to keep the resentment from bubbling up. I sat down at the perfectly set table alone, and pulled out my phone just to kill the silence. I opened Instagram, expecting to see some corporate post about the firm's new leadership. Instead, the first thing that popped up was a live notification from my sister-in-law Sarah. I clicked it without thinking. The screen was a blur of gold leaf, sparkling crystal, and the muffled roar of a high-end steakhouse. I recognized the venue instantly. It was the Gilded Lily, a place where you need a 3-month reservation and a deep pocketbook. The camera panned around a long white-clothed table. There was Mark, sitting at the head, looking more radiant and relaxed than I had seen him in years. To his right was his mother, Evelyn, draped in the silk scarf I had bought her for Christmas. To his left was a woman I didn't recognize at first, a younger, polished blonde in a cocktail dress that cost more than my first car. The table was covered in platters of oysters and magnums of champagne. My husband wasn't at the office. He wasn't doing paperwork. He was center stage at a gala event that had been meticulously planned without a single seat for the woman who had paid his tuition. Sarah's voice came through the speakers, shrill and dripping with a performative sweetness that made my skin crawl. She was narrating the event for her followers, panning the camera over the expensive appetizers. She zoomed in on Mark, who was laughing at something the blonde woman said. He looked so comfortable in his exclusion of me. It wasn't an oversight. You don't forget to invite your wife to a milestone celebration at a 5-star restaurant, unless you have intentionally erased her from the narrative. I looked down at my own hands, still stained with the scent of the rosemary I had chopped for a man who was currently eating Wagyu beef with a stranger. The camera stabilized as Evelyn stood up, clinking her crystal flute with a dessert spoon to command the room's attention. The restaurant noise faded into a respectful hush. She looked directly at Mark, her eyes gleaming with a triumph that felt predatory. She started speaking about his journey, about the long nights and the sacrifices. She spoke as if she had been the one proofreading his reports at 2 a.m. while she worked a double shift. Then she raised her glass high and looked toward the blonde woman. As I watched my ML toast to the woman who actually supported him, I realized I wasn't just forgotten, I was being replaced. The silence in my dining room felt heavy, a physical weight pressing against my chest as the glow from my phone screen began to dim. I didn't put the phone down. I couldn't. I just stared at the frozen image of the life Mark was leading without me. A life I had quite literally funded with my own sweat and exhaustion. People talk about the lean years of a marriage like they are some romantic hurdle, a period of shared struggle that strengthens the bond. But looking back now, those years weren't shared. I was the one leaning and Mark was the one being propped up. When we first started out, Mark had the ambition, but I had the stability. I remember working 60-hour weeks, juggling a corporate desk job by day and a freelance editing gig by night, just so he could focus entirely on his MBA. I didn't want him to have the distraction of student loans or the stress of a part-time job. I told myself it was an investment in our future. I lived on coffee and $3 protein bars while he sat in air-conditioned lecture halls, building the network that was currently sitting around that table at the Gilded Lily. I handled every domestic detail, from the laundry to the taxes, because his brain space was too valuable to be cluttered with the mundane realities of survival. It didn't stop at his degree. When his mother, Evelyn, faced foreclosure 4 years ago because of her own reckless spending, Mark didn't have the savings to save her. I did. I took the money I had been earmarking for my own dream of opening a boutique consulting firm and handed it over to a woman who currently didn't even have the decency to mention my name. I paid her mortgage for 18 months. I was the one who negotiated with her bank, the one who organized her piles of neglected mail, and the one who made sure she stayed in that house. I did it because she was family, and in my world, family meant you sacrifice until it hurts. I even acted as his unofficial chief of staff. Every networking event he attended, every gift sent to a superior, every meticulously drafted follow-up email that led to this promotion, it all came from me. I kept a color-coded calendar of his boss's birthdays and their wives' favorite flowers. I coached him on how to negotiate his salary, sitting across from him at this very table and playing the role of the tough interviewer until he got his pitch perfect. I was the architect of the man the world was currently applauding. He was the brand, but I was the entire infrastructure, the logistics, and the funding. I walked over to my laptop, my movements feeling robotic and cold. The anger hadn't fully arrived yet. It was replaced by a clinical, devastating clarity. I opened our joint accounts and my own personal records, pulling up the digital trail of a decade spent in service to Mark's ascent. I watched the numbers scroll by, the tuition payments, the mortgage transfers for Evelyn, the thousands of dollars spent on professional development that never seemed to include me. It was all right there in black and white. I looked at the bank statements on my laptop. I wasn't just his wife, I was his interest-free loan. And the loan just hit its maturity date. I sat there for a moment with my fingers hovering over the keys, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in the wine glass I hadn't touched. I have always been a person of data. I believe that emotions can lie to you. But numbers are cold, hard, and honest. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and titled it with a name that felt like a death warrant. I started at the very beginning, digging through 10 years of archived bank exports and credit card statements. This wasn't just a divorce preparation. This was a forensic reconstruction of a theft. The first column was dedicated to Mark's education. I found the wire transfers for his MBA tuition, totaling exactly $40,000. I remembered the month I sent that final payment. I had skipped my own sister's wedding in Italy because we supposedly couldn't afford the flight. Mark had hugged me and told me he would make it up to me tenfold. I added that to the list. Then I moved to the family line items. I found the $15,000 I had pulled from my inheritance to pay for Evelyn's emergency gallbladder surgery, and the subsequent private nursing care she insisted she needed. I found the $8,000 we invested in Sarah's handmade jewelry startup. A business that lasted exactly 3 months before she pivoted to a yoga retreat in Bali that I also ended up subsidizing. As I typed the figures, the math began to paint a nauseating picture. Over the last decade, I had funneled over $180,000 of my direct earnings and personal assets into the Mark and family enterprise. This didn't even account for the mortgage on our home, the utilities, or the groceries I bought while he was building his brand. I was looking at the price tag of my own disappearance. I had paid for the privilege of being the woman they eventually decided was no longer needed at the table. I saw the $3,000 for the designer watch Mark wore to his interview, the one I told him was a gift for his hard work. I saw the $500 a month he was sending to his mom for groceries, which I now realized was just a kickback for her loyalty to him over me. I felt a strange, detached sense of pride in my own efficiency as the spreadsheet grew. I was documenting the dissolution of a decade with the precision of an actuary. But then I noticed a recurring transfer that didn't make sense. It was a monthly outgoing payment of $2,000, labeled simply as management fees. It had been happening for the last 2 years. My heart started to rhythmically thud against my ribs. We didn't have a property manager. We didn't have a financial advisor. I followed the routing number, tracing it through a maze of digital footprints that Mark obviously thought I was too busy to ever investigate. I had always been the one to handle the big picture finances, but Mark had taken over the automated bill pay system a few years ago, claiming he wanted to take something off my plate. I had thanked him for his thoughtfulness. Now I saw it for what it was, a curtain. I logged into our secondary savings portal, the one we use for emergency repairs, and noticed the balance was suspiciously low. I dug deeper, pulling the transaction history from the bank's back end. Every time I had received a bonus or a commission from my consulting work, Mark had been skimming a percentage off the top. It wasn't going into a vacation fund. It wasn't going into his mother's mortgage. He had opened a separate, shielded account under a shell entity titled the MR Family Trust. I sat back, the rosemary scent from the kitchen now smelling like rot. The MR stood for Mark and Rebecca, Rebecca being the blonde woman from the Instagram story, the one his mother was currently toasting at the Gilded Lily. He hadn't just been careless with our money. He had been systematically extracting my wealth to build a nest for his next life. But then I found the secret fund. He wasn't just ignoring me. He was funneling our joint savings into a family trust I didn't have access to. The digital clock on the stove ticked over to 9:30, and the short ribs in the oven were now little more than charred remnants of a life I no longer recognized. For a split second, a wave of familiar self-doubt washed over me. I wondered if I was overreacting, if maybe the MR Family Trust was just some poorly managed surprise for our upcoming anniversary. That was the old me, the woman who made excuses for his coldness and rationalized his family's greed. I needed someone whose brain wasn't clouded by 10 years of misplaced loyalty. I picked up the phone and called my father. He's a retired circuit court judge who spent 30 years watching people lie for a living. He didn't even say hello. He just heard the tremor in my breath and said, "Tell me what he did, honey." I laid it out for him. I told him about the Instagram story, the blonde woman, and the secret transfers. I felt like I was narrating a bad Lifetime movie. But my father's silence on the other end was the loudest validation I had ever received. He didn't offer platitudes or tell me to work it out. He spoke with the clinical precision of the bench. He told me that what I was describing wasn't just a betrayal of the heart. It was a sophisticated attempt at asset stripping. He gave me a phone number and told me to call it immediately. "This isn't a family dispute anymore," he said. "This is a crime scene. Treat it like one." 10 minutes later, I was on a conference call with Marcus Thorne, a divorce attorney whose reputation for scorched earth litigation made him a legend in the city. I emailed him the PDF of my spreadsheet and the screenshots of the trust transfers. I expected him to tell me we'd need weeks of discovery. Instead, I heard the sound of a man flipping through pages and a low predatory whistle. Thorne didn't care about the emotional infidelity or the missed dinner. He cared about the fact that Mark had used my social security number to co-sign the very entity that was meant to disinherit me. Thorne explained that the trust was a textbook case of fraudulent conveyance. By moving marital assets into a private trust under a third party's name, while we were still cohabiting and filing joint taxes, Mark had committed a series of financial blunders that a man of his supposed intelligence should have avoided. He told me that the law doesn't favor people who try to hide the pot before the cards are dealt. As he spoke, the crazy feeling, that nagging voice in the back of my head telling me I was being difficult or unstable, evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, sharpened iron. I wasn't a jealous wife throwing a tantrum. I was a creditor coming to collect a debt from a fraudulent debtor. I asked Thorne what our next move was. I expected a slow buildup of paperwork and mediation. But Thorne knew the type of man Mark was, the kind of man who believes his own press releases. He told me that the moment Mark signed that VP contract earlier today, he had likely triggered a series of stock options and bonuses that were tied to his marital status for tax purposes. Mark was waiting for the ink to dry on his new life before he cut me loose. He was probably planning to serve me papers by the end of the week, once he was sure his new assets were safely tucked away in the MR Trust. My lawyer's words were chilling. "He's been planning to leave you the moment he got that VP title. You just beat him to the punch." I went upstairs and stripped off the apron that smelled like a domestic life that had died hours ago. I didn't cry. I didn't have time for the luxury of tears. Instead, I went to the back of the closet and pulled out the charcoal gray power suit I had bought for my own firm's launch, the one I had postponed so Mark could have his MBA. I put on my highest heels, the ones that make me look 6 feet tall and sound like a ticking clock when I walk. I did my makeup with a steady hand, painting on a deep red lip that felt like war paint. I looked at the woman in the mirror and didn't recognize her. She looked capable of anything. I grabbed the thick manila envelope Marcus Thorne had couched over to me via a midnight messenger, and I walked out the door, leaving the short ribs to rot in the dark. The drive to the Gilded Lily was the calmest I've been in a decade. I wasn't wondering where he was or why he hadn't called. I knew exactly where he was and I knew exactly what I was going to do. When I pulled up to the valet, the attendant looked at my car, a modest SUV I'd kept for years to save money, and then at my suit. He straightened his posture immediately. I didn't wait for him to open my door. I stepped out, handed him the keys and walked toward the gold-trimmed entrance of the restaurant. The interior was a cathedral of excess. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged steak. I didn't check in with the hostess. I simply scanned the room until I saw them. They were tucked away in a semi-private alcove, the kind of spot designed for people who think they are more important than everyone else in the room. There were 12 of them. Mark, his mother, his sister, the blonde woman, and several of his new colleagues from the firm. They were laughing, clinking glasses, and basking in the glow of a success I had manufactured. The moment my heels hit the hardwood near their table, the laughter died a sudden, jagged death. It was as if I had sucked all the oxygen out of the alcove. Sarah was the first to react, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, her phone still out as if she were waiting for the next content moment. But it was Evelyn, my mother-in-law, who moved first. She scrambled out of her chair with a speed that belied her age, placing her body between me and the table. She looked panicked, her eyes darting to Mark's boss, who was watching the scene with growing confusion. "Grace, what are you doing here? You're making a scene," Evelyn hissed, her voice a low, desperate vibration. She reached out to grab my arm, her fingers clawing at the expensive fabric of my sleeve. "This is a private celebration. You weren't expected. Please go home and we will talk about this tomorrow. Mark is in the middle of a very important dinner." I didn't pull away. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked down at her hand until she felt the sheer weight of my contempt and let go. I stayed eerily calm, my breathing slow and rhythmic. I wasn't the crazy wife they wanted me to be. I was a professional and I was here to conduct business. I stepped around her as if she were a piece of furniture that had been misplaced. The blonde woman, Rebecca, looked at me with a mix of pity and arrogance, as if she were watching a relic from Mark's past refuse to crumble. Mark finally found his feet. He looked like he had seen a ghost. His face, which had been flushed with wine and victory only moments ago, was now the color of ash. He smoothed his tie with a trembling hand, trying to maintain the senior vice president persona in front of his peers, but the facade was cracking in real time. He looked at the manila envelope in my hand and then at his boss, who was now leaning back in his chair, his eyebrows raised in sharp interest. The silence in the restaurant had spread to the surrounding tables. We were the only show in town. "Honey, look, this is just a misunderstanding," Mark stammered, his voice thin and reedy. He tried to force a chuckle that sounded more like a choke. "It's just a small family thing. A quick dinner to settle some business before the real party this weekend. I was going to call you as soon as we were done. You know how these corporate things are. It's just a small family thing." I really looked at him for the first time in years. I saw the cowardice tucked behind his expensive dental veneers, and the hollow ambition that I had mistaken for character. I pulled the papers from the envelope and fanned them out on the table, sliding them right over his plate of half-eaten steak. I smiled, and it was the coldest thing I have ever done. "Oh, I know," I said. "That's why I brought the paperwork to make it official." I didn't just stop at the divorce summons. While the table stared at the legal bluebacks with a mixture of horror and confusion, I reached into the envelope and pulled out the second document. This one wasn't for the court, it was for them. It was a 10-page itemized return on investment report, bound in a professional clear cover. I laid it down next to Mark's wine glass. I could see the sweat beads forming on his forehead, reflecting the candlelight. This was the forensic audit of a decade of exploitation, and I wanted every person at this table to see the receipts of the support Evelyn had been toasting to just moments ago. Mark reached for the document, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. He flipped to the first page and saw the bolded heading. Phase 1, Educational and Professional Capital. I didn't whisper. I spoke with the clear, projecting voice I had practiced for years in boardroom meetings, ensuring that even the waiters at the edge of the alcove could hear every syllable. I told the table that they were currently celebrating a promotion that had been purchased with my $40,000 tuition investment. I pointed out the line items for the thousands spent on his tailored suits, his country club networking fees, and even the very watch he was currently using to check how much time he had left before his reputation vanished. Then I turned to Evelyn. She was clutching her silk scarf as if it were a life preserver. I turned to page 4 of the report, titled Familial Subsidies and Debt Recovery. I announced to the entire party that the mortgage on her charming suburban home had been kept afloat by 15 monthly payments from my personal consulting account. I detailed the cost of her gallbladder surgery and the 2 weeks of private nursing care I had paid for out of my own inheritance, money my grandmother had left me for my future children, not for a woman who was currently helping my husband audition my replacement. The silence at the table was no longer just awkward. It was heavy with the weight of undisputed facts. Mark's boss leaned in, his eyes scanning the numbers with the clinical interest of a man who realized he had just promoted a fraudulent asset. I wasn't done. I turned to the final page, the summary of the afternoon's activities. I told the table that while they were ordering their second round of appetizers, I had been on the phone with 3 different banks and a forensic accountant. I informed Mark that the MR Family Trust he had so carefully constructed had been flagged for investigation of fraudulent conveyance. But more importantly, I had exercised my right as a primary account holder on our joint high-yield savings. Since he had seen fit to exclude me from his life, I had seen fit to include myself in the total recovery of my diverted funds. I had clawed back exactly $212,000, the total sum of my documented personal contributions over the last decade, and moved them to an offshore holding account under my maiden name. The color drained from Mark's face until he looked like a marble statue of a man who had lost everything. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry croak. He looked at Rebecca, the blonde woman, whose expression had shifted from smugness to a sharp, calculating fear. She wasn't looking at Mark with love. She was looking at a man whose bank accounts had just been gutted in real time. The wealth he had promised her was evaporating before her eyes, and she was realizing that the man she had been toasted for supporting was actually a hollow shell built on my credit score. I looked at my sister-in-law, Sarah, who was still holding her phone. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the upholstery. I remembered the $8,000 I had gifted her for that jewelry startup. The money she had used to buy her brand new white SUV instead of inventory. I turned to her and smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that had nothing to do with kindness. I mentioned that I had reviewed the title and registration for that vehicle this afternoon. In her haste to avoid taxes, she had allowed Mark to put the car in our joint marital name, likely intending to transfer it later. But later never came. I told her that since the car was technically a marital asset purchased with funds I had now reclaimed, I had taken the liberty of revoking the gift. I spoke clearly so the entire restaurant could hear the punchline of her little Instagram story. I explained that I didn't care about the car, but I did care about the principle of the debt. The SIL's face dropped when I mentioned the gifted car was actually in my name, and the tow truck was currently in the parking lot. The sophisticated, calm senior vice president persona that Mark had spent years cultivating didn't just crack. It shattered like cheap glass hit by a sledgehammer. He didn't try to deny the numbers. He couldn't. Instead, he did what all men of his particular brand of entitlement do when they are backed into a corner of their own making. He turned into a monster. He lunged across the table, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage that was a far cry from the polished husband the world saw. He slammed his fist down, sending the crystal glasses rattling and splashing red wine across the white tablecloth, a dark, permanent stain that matched the one he was currently putting on his career. "You think you're so smart," he roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the restaurant. "You think you can just walk in here and ruin my life? That money was mine. I earned it. I did the work while you sat at home playing accountant." I didn't flinch. I didn't back away. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and held it up with a steady hand. I made sure the lens was centered right on his sweating, livid face. I wanted every frame of this recorded, every snarl, every spit-flecked insult, and every admission of his own narcissism. I wasn't just collecting memories. I was collecting exhibits for the trial Marcus Thorne was already preparing. Mark's boss, a man who valued temperament above all else, looked at his new VP with a gaze that suggested he was watching a sinking ship from the safety of the shore. Then came the second act of the family play. Evelyn, seeing that Mark's aggression was only making things worse, pivoted to the only weapon she had left: victimhood. She began to wail, a loud theatrical sob that drew the attention of every diner in the room. She clutched her chest, leaning into the blonde woman, Rebecca, who looked like she wanted to be anywhere else on the planet. "How could you be so cruel, Grace?" Evelyn shrieked through her fake tears. "After everything we've done for you. We treated you like a daughter, and you turn out to be this money-hungry viper. You're trying to rob us. You're trying to take the food out of an old woman's mouth just because your ego is bruised." I kept the camera rolling. I panned from Mark's shaking hands to Evelyn's dry eyes, and then back to Sarah, who was frantically trying to delete her earlier Instagram stories as if the digital footprint of her betrayal could be erased by a thumb swipe. I remained the only silent person at the table, a stark contrast to their chaotic, desperate noise. Their entitlement was so profound that they actually believed I was the villain for asking for my own money back. They had spent 10 years treating my bank account like a communal well, and they were outraged that I had finally capped the spring. Mark saw that his mother's tears weren't moving me. He saw the recording light on my phone. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he had no leverage left. The secret fund was gone, his wife was gone, and his reputation was hemorrhaging in front of the people he most wanted to impress. He leaned over the table, his breath smelling of the expensive scotch I had bought him, and his eyes turned cold and dead. He stopped shouting and dropped his voice to a low, venomous hiss that the phone's microphone caught with perfect clarity. He looked at me with a level of hatred that was almost breathtaking. He didn't care about the divorce papers or the audit anymore. He just wanted to hurt me as deeply as I had hurt his pride. He wanted to make sure I knew that every sacrifice I had made, every hour I had worked, and every dream I had deferred meant absolutely nothing to him. Then the husband says the one thing he can never take back. "You were always just a stepping stone." The room went cold. The silence that followed Mark's admission was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually follows a car crash. A heavy ringing void where the world stops spinning for a second. Even Evelyn's theatrical wailing cut off abruptly. The stepping stone comment hadn't just insulted me, it had confirmed to everyone in that room, including Mark's boss and colleagues, that he was a man who used people as disposable tools. I didn't lower my phone. I wanted the camera to catch the exact moment his arrogance met the reality of a zero balance. Right on cue, a man in a sharp tuxedo, the floor manager, approached the table. He didn't look at me. He looked at Mark, whose credit card was currently sitting in a silver leather folder on the edge of the table. The manager's expression was the picture of practiced, high-end hospitality masking a deep professional annoyance. He cleared his throat softly, a sound that seemed to snap Mark back into the immediate problem of the $3,000 dinner bill. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Sterling," the manager said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the neighboring tables. "But it appears there is an issue with the corporate account provided for the reservation. The transaction was declined. When we attempted to run the secondary card for the MR Family Trust, that was also rejected by the bank. They've placed a restrictive hold on the funds." Mark's face went from the pale white of shock to a deep bruised purple of utter humiliation. He snatched the card back, fumbling in his wallet for another one. He produced a personal card, then another, then a third. One by one, the manager took them to the station, and one by one, he returned with a polite, devastating shake of his head. I watched as the reality of my Phase 2 audit finally hit home. By freezing the joint assets and flagging the trust for fraud, I hadn't just secured my future. I had effectively turned off the lights on their party. The manager's patience had clearly run out. Two large men in dark suits, security, materialized at the edge of the alcove. They didn't look like they were there to help with the codes. They stood with their hands clasped in front of them, their eyes locked on Mark and his family. The high society family was now just a group of people who couldn't pay their bill, and the restaurant was no longer interested in their status. "Perhaps we can discuss this in the back office," the manager suggested, though his tone made it clear it wasn't a suggestion. "We need to resolve the outstanding balance immediately." Evelyn looked like she was about to faint for real this time. Sarah was frantically looking through her purse, likely realizing she didn't have enough to cover even the tip. The blonde woman, Rebecca, grabbed her coat and stood up, not even looking at Mark as she tried to slip away, only to be stopped by one of the security guards. They were trapped in the very luxury they had tried to steal from me. I tucked my phone into my suit pocket and picked up my manila envelope. I had seen enough. The debt was being called in, and the people who had treated me like an invisible bank account were finally being seen for exactly what they were: bankrupt. As security escorted them to the back office, I walked out. But I wasn't done. I had one more stop to make: his new boss's office. I didn't go to the office that night. I went the next morning, exactly 10 minutes before the doors officially opened. I wasn't there as a grieving wife or a woman scorned. I was there as a whistleblower. Mark's firm, a high-stakes investment group, didn't just trade in capital. They traded in reputation. They had a morality clause in their executive contracts that was thicker than a phone book, designed to protect the firm from the exact kind of person Mark had proven himself to be. I knew this because I was the one who had read through his entire employment agreement 3 times to help him negotiate his signing bonus. I knew exactly which lever to pull to bring the whole structure down. I met with the managing partner, a man named Arthur who had toasted Mark's integrity only 12 hours prior. I didn't say much. I simply laid out a second manila envelope. Inside was the recording of Mark's verbal assault at the restaurant, a copy of the forensic audit, and most importantly, the evidence that Mark had used his corporate-issued laptop to facilitate the fraudulent transfers into the MR family trust. In the world of high finance, you can be a jerk, and you can even be a cheat, but you cannot be a liability who creates a digital paper trail of financial fraud on company hardware. Arthur's face remained a mask of stone as he reviewed the documents. He didn't look at the photos of the blonde woman. He looked at the routing numbers. He looked at the unauthorized use of company resources to hide marital assets. The math was simple. Mark was a genius at optics, but he was a catastrophic failure at ethics. And in Arthur's world, a failure in ethics was an insurance nightmare. The promotion wasn't just on the line. Mark's entire career was about to be scrubbed from the building's directory. By noon, the collapse was total. I received a brief, formal email from Marcus Thorne. Mark had been called into a private meeting the moment he arrived at work, likely nursing a hangover and the humiliation of the restaurant bill, and was told his services were no longer required. The promotion was rescinded. The bonus, which he had already mentally spent on Rebecca's lifestyle, was voided. Because of the nature of his termination, his stock options were frozen pending a full internal investigation into his use of the MR Trust. He had spent 10 years climbing a mountain I had built for him, only to be kicked off the peak by his own shadow. The most satisfying part of the collapse, however, wasn't the loss of the job. It was the immediate disintegration of his toxic support system. The moment the money stopped flowing, the family turned on him like a pack of starving wolves. Without my subsidies, Evelyn's house was back on the chopping block, and she blamed Mark for provoking me into taking my money back. Sarah, whose car had been towed from the Gilded Lily parking lot, while she was being questioned in the manager's office, was already posting on social media about how Mark had misled her. Even Rebecca, the woman who was supposed to be the upgrade, had blocked his number before the sun went down. She was looking for a senior vice president, not a disgraced middle manager with a frozen bank account and a pending fraud investigation. Mark was left in the wreckage of his own making, standing in a house that was technically half mine and filled with furniture he couldn't afford to keep. He had lost the title, the girl, and the fawning adoration of the mother and sister he had prioritized over our marriage. He was finally seeing the world without the filter of my protection, and he was realizing that he was completely alone. He had treated me like a stepping stone, forgetting that when you kick the stone away, you lose your footing. I spent the evening in a quiet hotel room on the other side of the city, sipping a glass of wine that I had paid for with my own unencumbered money. I turned my phone on Do Not Disturb, but the notifications still bled through. The screen was a constant strobe light of desperation. Mark had spent the last decade ignoring my calls when he was too busy with work. Now the roles had reversed, but he lacked my dignity. He called me 42 times that night begging. Not for me back, but for the password to the account I drained legally. 6 months is a long time in the world of finance, but it is a lifetime in the world of healing. I am currently sitting on a balcony in a sun-drenched apartment that smells like fresh eucalyptus and expensive coffee, not rosemary or resentment. This place is smaller than the house I shared with Mark, but every square inch of it belongs to me. It was bought and paid for with the final settlement Marcus Thorne wrung out of the wreckage of our marriage. The court didn't take kindly to the MR family trust, and by the time the judge was finished, I hadn't just recovered my interest-free loan, I had secured a significant portion of the assets Mark thought he had successfully hidden. I don't go looking for updates on my former life, but in the digital age, the ghost of your past always finds a way to haunt your feed. Yesterday, a mutual acquaintance's post drifted across my screen, and for the first time in a decade, I felt nothing but a cool, detached sense of closure. There was a photo of Sarah, the jewelry mogul and lifestyle influencer, was wearing a polyester uniform, working a midday shift at a retail clothing chain in the mall. The white SUV was nowhere to be seen. Without my monthly infusions of capital, her empire of glass and gold leaf had vanished, replaced by the reality of a $10 an hour wage. As for Mark, the golden boy has lost his luster. He couldn't find another executive role in this city. The recording of his restaurant meltdown and the morality clause termination made him radioactive to every firm within 100 miles. He's currently living in Evelyn's basement, the very house I saved from foreclosure, which is now buried under a mountain of debt they can no longer service. They are trapped in a cycle of blaming each other for the loss of the woman they once considered an invisible resource. They are finally experiencing the lean years they were so happy to let me carry alone. I closed the laptop and looked out at the city skyline. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the money or the ruined career. It was the fact that I no longer have to manage their lives. They called me a mistake for years. Now they're just a line item I've finally written off. If you're being forgotten by your in-laws, check your bank account. They probably haven't forgotten your money.